Okay, I would like at this point in time to call the meeting to order. Bienvenue à tous. First of all, I want to wish everyone a Happy New Year and all the best in 2011. And before we start the meeting, colleagues, what I'd like to do first is introduce our new committee clerk. We have with us Chad Mariage. He's come from the Canada-US Interparliamentary Group. He previously was a clerk in one of the other committees, so we wish Chad all the best as he takes on these new duties. And colleagues, this is a continuation of our ongoing study into the open government, and the committee is very pleased today to have before us Mr. David Eves. He's a public policy entrepreneur, open government activist, a negotiator. He works with the Harvard Negotiation Project. He's a fellow at the Centre of Study of Democracy and Diversity at Queen's University, and he's advised a number of governments, mainly municipal, and the government, of course, he was very involved with the government of Australia in their open government concept, and he would, in my opinion, if not the foremost, one of the foremost experts in this area here in Canada. So the committee is very, very pleased to have him before us, and we understand Mr. Reeves has about a 10-minute opening comment. I'm going to turn the floor over to him, and then we'll go to questions from committee members. Again, Mr. Reeves, welcome to the committee.
Thank you so much. I'd like to thank the committee for inviting me to come and speak with you today. I kind of wanted to kind of break down what I was going to do to be the most helpful possible, and so I've kind of got three big chunks of things I want to dive into. So the first is I want to just talk a little bit about where I think open government is, what it is, how we can define it, and try to give the committee a little bit of a framework to help shape their thinking and shape the recommendations that they may make. I then want to talk a little bit about the state that we're currently in, kind of where I think things are, and as well as kind of what the size of the opportunity is that's in front of us. And then finally, maybe to make just one or two specific recommendations that I think might be helpful, and then wind down and allow for questions, because I think that's actually where a lot of the meat is going to be. So, sorry.
I could just ask you to perhaps slow down a little bit. It's just the translation might have difficulty keeping up.
Sorry about that. It is a regular problem with me. So the first place I'd like to start is just talking about the term open government and open data, because I think there's a fair amount of confusion. I've noticed that this committee itself has been using those two terms almost interchangeably, and I think that's actually a mistake. I think these are actually two very different things, and I want to kind of break it apart. The notion of open government is kind of the overarching umbrella term, and I won't dive into it too deeply because I think it means lots of different things to lots of different people. But I think there are kind of three different pieces that, in our interest at least, kind of make it up, and I want to talk about each one of those. So the first is open data. Open data refers to kind of facts, the actual things that you would refer to as being like numbers. It might be a map. But these are they're generally numbers, and for people who are kind of new to the open data and the open government world, I really like to talk about this as being something that you would open in an Excel spreadsheet. Generally, it's not a lot of words. Generally, it's what we call machine readable, which means your Excel spreadsheet can open it up and you can look at it. So a budget, for example, would be a great example of open data. A map is a fantastic example of open data. Now, I want to separate that very, very clearly from a second piece, which is open information. Open information would be a report that's been written about data or about the state of the country. It could be about anything. Open information is the type of things that you would normally want to ATIP. It's the type of things that you would read. It would be a report written by the government. Open information and open data are actually quite different. Open information is it's a word. It's what we call unstructured data. So it's words, it's vocabulary. Data is structured data. So it looks like numbers, and it's usually confusing to most of us. The final piece is open processes. Open processes are kind of the decision-making tools of government. So this could range anything from a referendum to this committee to a consultation. And it's how open you make the decision-making within government. And the reason I want to break these three things out is because I actually think there are very different options available to us for each one of these types of categories. And I would hate for this committee to confuse open information with open data and make decisions that applies to open information, because actually it's a much more restricted realm that we're dealing with there. When it comes to open data, I think actually the doors are wide open. And it's in that category that I really want to focus my comments. In the last 4 or 5 years, there's been an explosion in the amount of data that governments are willing to share with their citizens. So in the United States, you have the launch of something called data.gov, which now I think has something over 200,000 different data sets that the US government now shares freely with its citizens. Anybody can go to their website, anybody can download this information. The British government has launched data.gov.uk, which has several hundred, I think several thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of data sets now as well, where you can go and download any information that the government has that they've put up on that website. I advised the Mayor of Vancouver. 2 years ago, we passed the open motion, and we launched an open data portal for the City of Vancouver. You'll now see that there's somewhere in the range of about 160 data sets the city shares with citizens that they can use to write reports, to make software applications, or to simply help rethink how city services are conducted. The reason I think this matters is right now we're kind of stuck in a world where we deal with all information like it's an atypical request. So everything has to go through ATIP. And you have to understand that I come from a generation of people that are growing up using Google, and the average length of a Google search is somewhere in the realm of about 30 milliseconds. The average length of time it takes to complete an ATIP request is somewhere in the range of 4 months. And that if you ask anybody under the age of 30 what they think of access to their government, the simple response is it's broken. We have a system that's been in place for 20, 30, 40 years that may have looked good when it was first initiated, but today, to anybody who's used to living in a digital era, simply appears broken. And the reason I wanted to subdivide these into 3 different problems is I recognize that the open process and the open information categories, those are tricky things to deal with, and there's a lot of competing interests. But I think in the realm of open data, we can make a number of very quick and very significant wins. We can architect a system that works literally for all citizens and not just for a small group of journalists or for a small group of very, very interested people who are willing to hang out and wait for months in order to get a piece of government information. So I think we can do a whole lot better, and I kind of want to talk a little bit about the core principle about why we should be doing better. I think this gets lost in all the conversations about access to information, about privacy, and about government secrecy. When it comes to raw data, the information the government collects about this country, about its citizens, this is a public asset. It doesn't look like a road. It doesn't hang like a bridge. It's not a building in which public servants work in. But it is as much a public asset as the building that we're sitting in right now. And with virtually every public asset that we have as a government, we go out of our way to make it as usable and as accessible to Canadians as we conceivably can. Because we know that those assets make for a stronger economy, they make for a stronger country. And yet, suddenly when it comes to data, we actually go out of our way to not share this public asset. We choose not to let Canadians understand how their government works, and we choose to not let Canadians use that information to strengthen their companies, to strengthen their families, to make their country better. And it's a problem that I don't understand. And then the small number of times when we actually do decide to make data accessible, there's very, very few times that we make it free. Instead, we actually charge it. And we've taken economics and we've turned it completely on its head. Because when you charge for data, there's an economic argument why this makes no sense, and there's a moral argument of why this makes no sense. The moral argument for why it makes no sense is what you have effectively done is you've taken an activity that all taxpayers have subsidized, and you are now only allowing the wealthiest to gain access to that information. That would make sense, maybe, if that asset were limited in its use. Like, there's only so many of us who can drive on a road. Every time we drive on the road, we make that road worse. So I can understand you want to toll the road because you want to kind of capture some of the revenue from the people who actually are using that asset so that you can pay to keep it up to date. The problem with data is that if, Mrs. Freeman uses that data, it doesn't suddenly become less valuable to me. If Mr. Murphy uses that data, it doesn't become less valuable to me. It's just as valuable as it was before. So here, kind of in government economics, we take all of the assets that actually erode, like our roads, and we very rarely toll them. We allow people to use them for free. And we take all the assets that never erode, that can be reused infinitely, and we actually charge for them. So I think one of the biggest crimes that we have in this country at the moment is that we charge for an enormous amount of StatsCan's data. Okay, here is information about how communities function, about how healthy people are, about who they are as Canadians, and we make that information hard to access. The other piece is we're creating barriers to entry to all sorts of new and interesting, potentially disruptive companies. That when you begin to look at the information that's getting released out there, it's starting to do some very interesting things. We're still very, very early on. But when you think of the companies that have emerged in the digital economy, most of those companies emerge because they have become profoundly good at organizing and leveraging and making use of data. And you think of a company like Google, all Google does is organize, offer up, and make use of data. And who knows what company could emerge in Canada if the Canadian government made that information available about what new services people might imagine, what efficiencies could be gained, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. So what's the kind of the opportunity that's in front of us? What are some of the reasons why I think we should be thinking about open data and making the information that government has more accessible to the public, especially the data? So I think for government, there are kind of 3 or 4 or 5 reasons that really come to mind. The first is we could reduce ATIP requests. Here we have an enormous cost where we have people rifling through documents, trying to figure out what can be shared and what can't be shared. And I think there's a whole bunch of data that we could frankly just share, and we would reduce the cost of having to filter it out. And here I understand even MPs would find this useful. My understanding is that most MPs have kind of a running access information request where they want to know how much money the federal government spent in their riding every quarter or every year or every month. But one could imagine that rather than having to make that request over and over and over again, if the government simply made that data available on a website, you could simply go and download it. Rather than having to wait days, possibly weeks, or even months getting information, you would have it as fast as your internet connection. And not only would you have it, everybody who lives in your riding would have it, everybody who has a business in your riding would have it, every citizen in the country could gain access to it. The second reason why I think open data is interesting for us to engage in is because I think it has another cost driver. It kind of reduces cost in government, which is that when you look at open data portals around the world, it is not uncommon to see that the biggest users of open data portals are government employees. That right now you have all these public servants all across Ottawa sitting on information that they'd actually love to share with one another, and that would allow for a more effective policy to be made, and that they have no mechanism by which to easily do that. That when you create an open data portal that you share information with the public, you have actually also created a portal where you share that data with public servants. So for example, when I talked to the guy who runs the open data portal in Washington, D.C., in the city, I asked him, who's the biggest user? And he said, oh, it's public servants. Because for years they've wanted to gain access to what the crime rates were in this region, or what the budget was over here, or what pollution was doing over in this region, and they had to go through 5 different people in order to get that, and now they can simply go and download it. But I think the biggest opportunity is finding cost savings, and this is what the Tories have realized in the UK. And the Conservative government in the United Kingdom now shares actual spending data down to the 25,000 K level with the public. And in some ministries, they share it down to the 500-pound level. And they have literally invited the public to come and take a look at their books and help them find where the waste is. And if you don't think that could matter here, I have one brief story I'd like to share with you, which is A couple years ago, a friend of mine was asked by a colleague to assess the charities in the Greater Toronto Area. And so they went to the Canadian Revenue Agency, which eventually gave them all of the information about charities in a spreadsheet in the Toronto area. And they were working away on this information, and on a lark, they decided one day, why don't I just sort these charities by the number of tax receipts issued? And when they did that, something astounding happened. Now, the United Way is the single largest charity in the Toronto area. It generally raises about $100 million a year. And yet, the United Way only placed third on this list. There were two larger charities that had issued something around the range. One, I think, had issued $160 million. The other one had issued somewhere in the range of $230 million in tax receipts. And in fact, I think it seemed like 6 of the top 15 charities on her list she had never heard of. And so once you began to crunch the numbers, and once you began to dive deeper and look at these charities, it became very obvious that these charities were actually not charities, that some of them were tax evasion schemes, and some of them were engaged in fraud. And that when you looked at what these charities had collected over a 5-year period, the total amount of foregone tax revenue for the Canadian government and the cost to Canadian taxpayers was $3.2 billion. This is an enormous sum of money for us. If the CRA's data had actually been made open and had been made available, I can imagine two things. One is someone probably somewhere would have created a graph that would have showed different charities in the Toronto area, and it would have shown a charity that had gone from 60,000 in charitable receipts one year to 20 million in the next year, to 60 million in the year after that, to 120, then to 240, and someone somewhere would have said, I either need to hire that executive director because they are running the most amazing charity in Canada, or something serious is going on. And I actually think that if they had made that public, that data public, and if someone had created that site, it might have prevented that charity from even emerging in the first place, because the simple scrutiny of the public being able to see them would have prevented that type of scam from emerging. So for me, I think the opportunity around government is an enormous amount of cost saving, and also an opportunity to kind of monitor what we're doing and to see the problems as they're emerging, and then finally to take the government services that we have and augment them. Someone's tried to do that with just what you guys do here in the House of Commons. I think you interviewed Michael Mully, who's a friend of mine in Montreal, and he's created Open Parliament, the website. And here he's taking data that you create in your own parliament, and he's put it in a website that's far more accessible than the parliamentary website. In fact, I know public servants in Ottawa now who use that website to track what their ministers are saying and doing so they can stay on top of what the government's agenda is and what the debates are. So these are the types of services that we can make more efficient. The other reason why I think we should be doing open data is I actually think it strengthens our economy. When I think of the billions of dollars that were spent on strengthening the Canadian economy coming out of the recession, I'm saddened to think about how little of it was spent on the type of infrastructure that's going to be so powerful in the 21st century, which is better data. Why didn't we simply make all of StatsCan data publicly available? And if you think of kind of some of the big examples of how data has transformed the Canadian economy, I have a few examples, very quick examples for you. The first is weather. The Canadian government collects weather information and shares it. In the United States, the US government does the same thing. It is estimated that in the United States, the economy generated by open weather information is roughly in the range of about $2 billion. And you just think about it. Think of all the logistics firms that are now giving advice on when to move goods based on the weather information they have that's been made available to them freely by their government. Think of all the individual decisions made by commuters about whether or not they're going to take the bus or whether they're going to drive, all the oil that gets saved by people who feel, actually, I can ride my bike today, or I can take the bus, or I'm not going to bring that, I'm going to not bring that umbrella, or I'm going to dress more appropriately, all the productivity hours that are gained there. The amount of wealth generated by weather data is almost incomprehensible. And that is a single data set that this government creates and shares. And if we began to imagine what was possible with the hundreds of thousands of data sets that you have at your disposal, I can think of an economy that is much more resilient, much more vibrant than the one we have now. Another example is GPS data. I think if we're really honest with ourselves, GPS data was created so that we could deploy nuclear warheads with enormous precision on people that we don't like. nobody sat, Tim O'Reilly, so he says, nobody sat around when developing GPS data saying, yeah, GPS data will be really interesting when people have cell phones so they can tell everybody where they are, or that they can log into Google Maps and figure out how not to get lost. But think of the billions of barrels of oil every year that are not expended because people no longer get lost because they can simply figure out where they are because of a GPS device. This is the power of open data. So what I really kind of want to challenge you guys to think about is, as you're making kind of your recommendations, as you're thinking about what the future of government is, I want you to understand that there is a huge opportunity in the data that this government sits on. And if you share it, there is a citizenry out there that wants to make use of it to better understand how the government works, to hold you to account, I'll be honest, and to build the economy of the next century. Because what we're really trying to figure out is, if we are going to have kind of a knowledge-based economy, we're going to have a knowledge-based government that's going to want to engage with a knowledge-based citizenry. And they already exist. They're already trained, they're already skilled, they're already thinking about this stuff. They're just sitting around and waiting for someone to give them some materials to make that economy a reality. So I've talked for long enough. I'll stop there, but I'd love to hear your questions and answer them the best that I can.
Thank you very much, Mr. Eves. We're going to go to the first round of questioning. Dr. Bennett, seven minutes.
Thanks very much. And I think I just want to give the 7 minutes back to you, David, to just keep going. And I think you alluded to the information piece. I mean, the data sets, I think, we get in terms of the information piece. Where do you draw the line? And when could the default position just be that it's open and government just selects a few things that they feel are public security or whatever? On the decision-making piece, which was, I think, the third one, I would just like to know how that would work and how can you do the open processes piece other than grants and contributions or those sorts of things. What would that look like? And I guess the last thing would be your advice for this committee in terms of how we go forward and who we should be talking to, and if how you think we do a proper piece of work.
So I have a couple of thoughts. The first is around the open information, the kind of division between the two. I think what the British have done is incredibly interesting. The British are now contemplating setting up a kind of a public data corporation, which will house the kind of regularly collected data that the government uses. And it's a very interesting model. Basically, you're trying to centralize the actual data they collect. I think it's a model that this government should be looking at. It's certainly the model that's used by the city of Washington, D.C., and it's the reason why they've been able to move so quickly. For me, that's where I would define data. It's the information that this government chooses to regularly collect about the country. And there might be data that on the offhand, every once in a while, someone commissions a report, they want to know something. I think we should share that as well. But I actually think at the heart of it, there's a core set of data that we regularly collect, and that is a public asset. And frankly, our tax dollars paid for it, and I'd like to know why you're not sharing it with me. The second piece around kind of information, I want to be really clear with the committee. I recognize the importance of a government, of the government's need to have a certain degree of privacy when developing policies and ideas. I do not think that under all circumstances is it wise for every idea to be shared with the public as it's being formulated. There are ideas that are controversial, there are ideas that need to be explored, there are ideas that need to be nurtured, and they deserve to have the privacy of a government in order to do that. What I do think you need to be, if I was going to make some recommendations, the recommendations I might make are, I would radically reduce the time length between when a document is made versus when it's made public. The second is, I would insist that any document now that is being released, where it exists in a digital form, be released in that digital form. So if you happen to have it in a Word document, please release it in a Word document. Don't print it out and send it to me. One of the most powerful things about digital media is that they're searchable. When you dump 3,000 printed out documents onto me, you are effectively not releasing those documents to me. Am I really going to spend go through 3,000 different pieces of paper and find the relevant piece of information? When a citizen asks for a piece of information and you send them printouts, you're effectively telling them, we are denying your access to information. And I think you are actually disrespecting them in a really, really profound way. So I would want to make that recommendation. I would also love for this committee to rethink the rules under which information is released, and even how, how parliamentary privilege works. Like right now, for example, when the video of this committee is released, no one's going to be allowed to use that video to do anything they want, and people can rebroadcast that video. But for example, if somebody wants to make fun of me and take this video and mash it up with a song, my understanding is right now their rights are actually quite limited in doing that. They certainly can't do it with any of you. So you see in the United States there's the Daily Show, and they regularly show the House of Representatives and the Senate, and they make fun of them, but it's a way of educating people. That's the satire that's so important. You can't do any of that in Canada. So there's these restrictions on how data can be used. And then finally, when it comes to processes there, I actually have less to say because I think kind of a lot of the thinking around what open processes look like today are built around the current way that we share information. And that if we shared a lot more information, a lot more data with the public, the types of processes we'd want would also change dramatically. So for example, if this government chose to make its budget open, and so simply released the Excel spreadsheet of the budget and said, everybody in the world, go and analyze it. You tell us where the problems are. I think you'd have people who came and talked to you who, A, were much, much better informed. So there'd be, this committee would work in a very, very different way because rather than re-educating the people who are coming to present to you or having them tell you things that are incorrect because they didn't understand the 3,000 pieces of paper they had to go through, the system would be much, much faster, and the way that you'd want to engage people, I think, would begin to change. So I'm kind of hesitant to go into that place because I think that world's going to evolve depending on what we do in the other two places.
And in terms of the work of the committee?
I'd love to see, I'd love for you to look at the Australian government's Gov 2.0 task force and look at the recommendations that they made and the way that they tackle the problem. I think actually a fairly short and concise document that makes 10 very, very clear recommendations would be very powerful. I think one of the things that I actually love about the work that you're doing is a lot of it doesn't actually require the House of Commons to have a big vote or for legislation to change. It can simply be changed if people in authority decide that they want to change it.
And in terms of us doing a e-consultation, do you have some advice as to how we would find the people that would be interested in it, how we make sure that the traffic comes to give us advice?
So I think if you want to do an e-consultation, that's great. My only advice to you is if you do an e-consultation, make sure that the people who you actually ask for their input, make sure their input gets used in any document that you finally create. And people always say, someone was mentioning to me just today that, that if you look at the British, they did a big e-consultation about how to make government better, and I think there were hundreds and hundreds of submissions that were made, and functionally, the government turned around and said, yeah, we're doing all of them already. And I'm not sure that was an answer that satisfied a lot of people who felt actually they weren't. And so now everybody goes, well, now it's very hard for people to get mobilized by these types of initiatives in government. And I'm like, I'm not surprised. The last time you asked them, you didn't do any of the things that they asked, and so why should they now take the time and energy? So I think the most important thing in any kind of consultation like that, whether it's in person or online, is make sure you really engage and respect.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bennett. We're now going to go to Madame Freeman. Madame Freeman, 7 minutes.
Good afternoon, Mr. Eves. Thank you for your presentation, which was very interesting, and thank you for the letter you sent to us so we could prepare for this meeting. You point out several things in your letter, including 4 elements I understand you, but it's hard to hear because there's because the sound isn't very good in the room.
On va d'ailleurs aborder ce sujet du bilinguisme.
In fact, I would like to address the matter of bilingualism as well. I'm sorry, I'm too advanced to understand your technology here. Yes, it is very complicated. Yes, sometimes you feel you need a degree to operate these headphones.
Alors, je voulais vous remercier pour...
Again, I wanted to thank you for your presentation and thank you for the letter you sent us to prepare for this meeting. In your letter, can you hear? You can hear. Good, we'll continue in that case. So, in that letter, you make recommendations, including establish a common understanding of the current state of affairs within government, and to meet with the Chief Information Officer. In fact, we will meet with Ms. Charest next week. And in fact, today it was revealed in the papers that Ms. Charest is already beginning to work on a portal. Perhaps she is more advanced than we think, and we'll get a big surprise next week, and that we are already in the digital age. Maybe we'll be completely surprised, but no, actually, I'm joking. Second recommendation, you talk about transforming the committee. You said that this committee might slow down open government, and so you're recommending the creation of a task force? I'm sorry, I'm not quite finished yet. So you said that we should have a Government 2.0 task force involving members of parliament and experts, technical experts and strategic experts. And this task force would help us make progress at the federal level. I would ask you to elaborate on that. And second, I would like to talk about access to information and bilingualism. And then I have other questions, but we'll begin with those two. I will begin to respond in French, but I'll switch into English if something is a little more complex, and I want to make sure I'm clearly understood. As far as the task force is concerned, I don't want you to create something new. I think that the task force is a model for how you can address this issue. In Australia, it wasn't only people from within government. They asked all kinds of people, such as myself, public servants, people from the private sector. Everyone was invited and asked, what do you need? What would you like to see here in Australia? As far as the future of government is concerned, so really it was a process which involved a lot of people. But here we have a group of people. You're all very intelligent, but you are all in government. And what I'm saying is that we should find ways of importing people from the outside. I don't want to see another task force which is separate from you, because that will make it even longer to make recommendations and take action. You mentioned the model of Great Britain, and you're also talking about the Australian model, and now you're talking about a more or less a Canadian model. Of course, this would take political will from the highest levels to create such a task force. That's the most important thing. But regarding the model you are suggesting, what exactly do you want here?
I'd love to see this group model itself a little bit after the Australian task force to make similar type recommendations. And then I would love to see the government look at those recommendations and figure out how they can fit them into their agenda. And I think there's an enormous opportunity. I mean, one of the things that makes me most excited about the open data agenda is how much appeal it should have across the political spectrum. I mean, here you have in the United Kingdom, you have a conservative-led coalition government, which is using open data very strategically to try to rethink how government operates and how it spends money and how efficient and how effective it is. And meanwhile, you have governments at the local level here in Canada that have a much more social agenda, are trying to think about, discovering what are the types of challenges that are going on in our communities, and then also trying to rethink how we deliver government services to make them more effective. And so, for me, the model that's most exciting is that you can have a strong committee like this one, make some very clear recommendations that I think can have some pan-partisan appeal, and then a government that I think, given its ideological roots, could probably grab some of those recommendations and run with them.
Thank you very much. I'd like to address another subject. You wanted to talk about bilingualism. Yes, exactly. I'm getting to that. we met with Ms. Legault, the Access to Information Commissioner, and she raised 4 or 5 issues regarding access to information and transparent government. In her 4th point, she talked about the problems which might be encountered, copyright, official languages, and privacy protection. We will hear from the Official Languages Commissioner soon, but in one of your pieces, I read about your vision of how we can maintain access to information. You talked about a Google translation. I wanted to put your point of view to Mr. Fraser to see whether what you're suggesting is doable. I think Google Translate is not the ideal way to get translations. So what do you think that we should do? Because Google Translation could be greatly improved. Please tell us how you think we should address the matter of bilingualism and access to information.
Cool stuff. I really want to make sure I get it right. So the article you were referring to is an article that I was very despondent to read, in which an RCMP detachment in British Columbia was forced to pull down, I think it was 2,000 old press releases because they weren't available in both official languages. And they had previously been using Google Translate to translate the English releases into French. So for me, I'm floored by the fact that what we have functionally done is made our government more opaque in pursuit of more opaque. So now no one in either English or French can now ever see these documents, right? This is a terrible outcome. At the same time, like, I'm a product of bilingualism. Mon français, c'est
My French is less than passable, but I understand, and I speak a little.
So the danger about that is you're looking at Google Translate as it exists now. That's right. Like, Google Translate 12 months ago was far worse. And Google Translate 12 months from now is going to be significantly better. Right? You have to understand, look at what Google did with spell check. That in a very short period of time, they built the most effective spell checking system in the world, simply because everybody was constantly updating it for them. So they were able to draw on millions and millions and millions of users. They're doing the exact same thing with Translate. So the rate of improvement of Google Translate is logarithmic. It's probably getting better, faster and faster. So we've actually extricated ourselves from a system right as it's about to get phenomenally better. And if we actually wanted to make Google Translate better still, I don't know, but someone should call Google and should say, like, this is a system that gets better when they can compare documents. So there is one organization in the world that has an enormous quantity of documents in both English and French, and that's the Government of Canada. So if we really wanted to make Google Translate very effective tomorrow, someone should call Google and say, why don't you take all of our documents that we have in both English and in French and put them into your computers, and it will dramatically improve the effectiveness. I think it also have a nice piece and part of it, which is that, kind of Canadian French and Canadian English would then become even more predominant within the Google ecosystem. But that aside, if we wanted to make Google Translate better, we could it's in our power, or at least we could ask Google. And frankly, we probably didn't have to ask them. Someone could just create a software program that just fed both into their systems without their desire, and we would make Google Translate significantly better.
Adam Freeman?
I think we have a shared interest in that I want documents to be available in both languages, but most importantly, I want documents to be available in at least one language. Like, so if a document's only available in French, I want to know, because then at least I can ask to translate it. And I think the huge opportunity around data is that most data doesn't need to be translated. Right? You don't need to translate an Excel spreadsheet except for maybe the headers across the top. So when I think of, like, the places where we can move most quickly, one of the reasons data comes to mind is because that's the easiest place to go.
Juste terminer en vous disant que peut-être dans un univers numérique.
I'd like to conclude by saying that perhaps in a digital universe we could translate in several languages, be it Spanish or others. Yes, I think that's very, very close. Thank you very much. My time is up, unfortunately.
Aaron, thank you, Mr. Eves, for your testimony today. It's been very helpful, as has your writing and your blog and all kinds of other things as well. I wanted to ask you, just first off, and not to spend a lot of time on this, but you describe yourself as a public policy entrepreneur. Can you say a little bit about how you understand that and how it kind of relates to the discussion we're having today?
So mostly I try to find places where I think there is an opportunity to make significant leaps in the way that we engage in solving a problem. Usually that has a kind of a public policy angle, and I try to write and think and wherever possible act in order to do that. And so for example, even here in the open data space, people in the committee may not know, but along with some colleagues, I created a data portal for the Canadian government. Since you didn't have one, I said, I'll create one for you. So if you go to data.gc.ca, I'm obviously not allowed to own a .gc.ca website. Only Government of Canada officials can do that. But I created that website, and then several colleagues and we just kind of mapped where all the data was already, because you actually already share. I mean, the exciting thing about what you guys are doing is there's already a policy infrastructure to share data in the federal government. So I was like, why don't we just go find it all, bring it into one site, and then we've created the open data portal for you. And I think that site actually helped push the government and help public service. I think it brought it to the fore here. It's pushed the government to start thinking about this stuff. So there is as an entrepreneur, I think I felt I've been able to push the agenda by finding high leverage places like that.
Now, I know some of it's out of the goodness of your heart, but you're trying to make some money doing this. How does a public policy entrepreneur make money doing this in this kind of process? Because clearly you're talking about people earning a living and making money, contributing to an economy doing this. So how does that, as somebody who's doing that, how does that happen?
So for me, I mean, if the question is how David Eves makes his money, David Eves makes his money through a combination of negotiation consulting. So I advise kind of Fortune 500 companies and some other groups, and I advise them, and then I do a lot of public speaking. But one of the things is, I think, do I hope that there are going to be companies that are going to emerge out of this space? Absolutely. Am I someone who would think about launching such a company? If I thought, if the right opportunity came up, I definitely would. So I wouldn't want to be seen as being totally impartial.
So what other kind of job titles or job descriptions would people do who are interested in using this kind of thing? Like who is interested in doing this and taking this information? So
it's actually just to show you how significant the issue of data, whether it's from government anywhere, is. So I was at LinkedIn in San Francisco at their head offices 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago for a presentation, and this guy from LinkedIn, he kind of got up and he said he had this great chart where he showed the number of people who had analytics in their job title graphed over time, and it starts off like infinitesimally small, and now we're into skyrocketing growth. It's just taking off. You have to understand our entire economy is being digitized, and the moment you say that, it's getting digitized how? Well, into some form of data. So I would actually be kind of wandering around and looking at, okay, well, what are the companies that are making use of data? What are the companies that are kind of figuring out ways to make themselves more efficient and more effective? And it's everything from natural resources who are using federal government data around the kind of where resources are in this country to figure out how they can be more effective and how they can harm the environment less, to people over at RIM who are figuring out how to create applications that make lives more useful. I mean, I think that there will be a number of interesting companies, and there'll be a number of interesting uses that will arise, and every jurisdiction is going to have a different one. In Vancouver, the real story, and this is a group that I am involved in, and maybe we'll do something more interesting with it, was in Vancouver the garbage day changes every time there's a statutory holiday, because they don't want you to go 2 weeks without getting your garbage picked up. So that means your garbage day might be Monday one month, but then it might be Wednesday the following month. And obviously people have a hard time keeping track of that. And all the government does is give you a printout at the beginning of the year with a map and what zone you live in and what your garbage schedule looks like. And so because they made that data open, we put that data into Google Maps. So you could just go to a website and called Van Trash. You click on the zone, it tells you what your schedule is. But then you could also download that schedule into your iPhone and your BlackBerry, which currently the government can't do. Or if you gave us your email address, we'd email you the day before garbage day to remind you. So that's the type of that's like a very, very small type of and maybe that could be a company, right? That's a very, very small example, but I want you to begin to think about what are all of the services that we offer, what's all the information we have, and what are all the ways it can be helpful for people, and it's going to be baked into our economy to make our lives more efficient and more effective. And I think there are the opportunities not insignificant.
Right now, Luke and Kevin, who are doing the Van Trash site, though, are sort of begging for donations to keep the site going, though. So it's not an economically viable thing for them.
Yeah. So I've been working with them very closely. I think come back to us in about two months, and we'll have a different answer for you.
Okay. I wanted just a quick question about the Australians 2.0 Commission. Just to be clear, that wasn't a parliamentary committee. It was a task force established by government with non-political people, basically.
That's correct.
And with a mandate to investigate all of this. So very different than what we're doing here.
Absolutely.
So that when you talk about political will, this is something that this committee could deal with. The technicalities of the 2.0 Commission are sort of outside of our scope, probably. But
yeah, but I think if you look at the types of recommendations that committee made, or that task force made, I think they're very applicable to the types of issues that you're looking into, and I think there's a number of recommendations in there that I think you might look to as models.
Okay. You talked about how there are restrictions on the way that the House of Commons and Parliament puts on the use of information that's developed here or made here, and you contrast that with what Americans are doing. And I know you've talked about what the White House does. It's a very sharp contrast to that. Can you say a little bit about how the White House approaches this?
The Americans have a wonderful system where all government information that is created is by default public domain. It has no license. There's no restriction. So you can use it to do anything you want. You can change it. You can build an entire business around it. You can turn it into satire. So there's no limit on the creativity that's available to them. And what I love about this, and as someone who believes kind of in the rights of citizens, is what the Americans have managed to evade, at least when it comes to their government information, is a permission culture. In Canada, we have permission culture. If you want to use Canadian government information, okay, but you better talk to us first, or at least read the fine print about what you're allowed and what you're not allowed to do. You have a creative idea, you have a piece of art, you have a company, you want to do all those things, make sure you check the fine print. In the United States, no permission is required. If I have a creative idea, I can go and try it out. I can fail, I can succeed, but it's up to me. And it makes sense because my tax dollars already paid for all this information.
How long has that system been in place?
From the very beginning.
Okay, so they've had long experience with.
Yeah, and this is one of the things. This is one of the reasons why I think you need to look at this so closely. Is people will say, well, if we lift Crown copyright, who knows what will happen? Well, to our south, we've had a neighbor who's never had Crown copyright, and they have done, I don't know, relatively well, economically and politically. So someone needs to explain to me what the risk is.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sixley. Mr. Polyev, 7 minutes.
Yes, thank you very much for being with us today, Mr. Eves. Read that you're a public policy entrepreneur and open government activist, negotiation expert. You've been involved in study into democracy and diversity at Queen's University, and you've submitted in 29 September 2009 the view that there are 3 laws to open government, and I want you to help us dissect them a little bit more. The first rule was, if it can't be spidered or indexed, it does not exist. So perhaps you could help us with the nomenclature a little bit. Start with spidered.
So I also want to kind of just focus the conversation again. Those were the 3 laws of open data, not of open government.
Sorry, open data.
No, it's okay. I just want to make. I feel it's very important this committee have a very strong framework for understanding this problem.
Okay.
Spidered and indexed means can the data be found? Most of us now look for information using a search engine on the internet, whether that's Yahoo or Google or Microsoft Bing, but we use one of those to go and find information. Well, there's a reason why those search engines know where all the information is, and it's because they do what we call spidering. They have little things that kind of float around the internet and go and find where the information is, so they can then point you to it when you look for a relevant term. So if you happen to have, data that you say you're willing to share with the world, but that you have it on a server that's not connected to the internet, or that you don't allow Google or Microsoft or Yahoo to spider an index, in my opinion, you don't have open data. Because if it's open but nobody can find it, it's really not that open. So that's the first rule.
Okay. If it isn't available in an open and machine-readable format, I think the first clause of that statement is self-evident. But machine-readable, how do you define machine-readable? Do you mean that would have to be readable by your average personal computer or MacBook that a Canadian would have sitting in their living room?
Yeah, that's exactly it. So like this piece of paper is not a machine-readable document. Right. And a PDF, which is very often the publication vehicle of choice for most governments, I would argue is not a machine-readable document. You open it in a machine, but very often you can't copy the text out of it, or even if you can, it copies in a very messy way. I want the data in a format that I can reuse it.
Okay, so do you have, is PDF your only concern, or?
No, I mean, I think we can talk about, I don't think that it's in the interest of this committee to get into the specifics of the file formats that one should publish in, but I think there's a lot of good practices out there. So if you look at, for example, the City of Vancouver's Open Data Portal, very frequently they will share data sets in several different types, in several different formats. And that way the user can choose the one that most fits their need. And it means you can use it in formats that are kind of broadly more open, but if you want a format that's more closed, you can do that too.
Okay, and so just so that we delineate the line between machine readable and non-machine readable, is there some sort of definition that you can provide beyond the notion that PDF is not, but other forms are?
So I think the short of it is can I play with the data?
Okay.
Because if I can't play with it, then it's not open.
Okay. The third was, if a legal framework doesn't allow it to be reproduced. Are you referring there to copyright, government copyright?
Or, yeah, sometimes it's copyright, sometimes it's a licensing agreement. So many governments will say, so for example, this used to be true in Vancouver before we wrote the open motion. There was information that was shared on the city's website, so there was data that was available, but they actually had a disclaimer that says, you know, you can look at this, but don't dare use it to do anything. Don't use it in your company, don't use it in your nonprofit, don't use it to do any of these things. And so it's not particularly helpful for me if you share data with me and then tell me, oh yeah, you can look at the data, you can play with it and do amazing things with it, but you can't share it with anybody, because the moment you say that, then what am I supposed to do?
So that does sound like a copyright issue.
Yeah, so copyright would be one form of restriction that might apply to a data set.
Okay.
And that's what makes the Americans so interesting, is that they don't have there's no license, at least at the federal level, there's no license for that data. It is public domain.
Because it's they consider it sort of a public asset.
That's right.
Okay. And does that copyright, the absence of copyright, apply to foreigners, or does it just apply to American citizens?
I believe it's for anybody.
Anybody in the world?
Yeah.
Okay.
Anybody in the world can go to data.gov and download a data set.
Now, if I could just go back to the first two rules then, indexation, spidering, if I'm inventing a word, machine readability. Can you give us a tangible idea? For the average Canadian who doesn't spend a lot of time on this, what would this provide? What kind of, like, in a very tangible sense, they sit down at their computer, they want to know something about the way the government operates, spends money, allocates resources, etc. Tell them, that person, how your vision would allow them to do that. Would they start, would they go to a website and then click in a search box, or type a search term in a box and hit enter, or give a very clear, simplistic, if you don't mind, version of how this would affect the daily life of a consumer of information interested in looking into the government of Canada?
So So I want to be clear, I don't think that if we start sharing information tomorrow that I think millions of Canadians are going to show up and start downloading this data. And I actually think that would be a terrible metric to use. The way we need to measure this isn't by the number of people who downloaded a given data set, but it's by the economic value and by the kind of democratic engagement that it spurs. And there you might only have a single person who downloads the data set, but does something quite interesting with it. So for example, the van trash, the example I talked earlier about the garbage reminder service, the only person who ever downloaded the data set from the city was Luke Kloss and Kevin Jones. There's like one download. But they created a service now that 3,000 people use, and that they derive regular and daily benefit from because they no longer forget to take the garbage out. In the UK, people have taken the budget data and they have made it presentable in all sorts of different ways so that people can now look at their budget and understand it for the first time. So you have tens of thousands, if not millions, of Britons who are showing up and looking at their government's budget and understanding how it works for the very first time. So again, there might have only been a single download, but you have an enormous increase in the number of people who kind of engage and understand how the government works. There is, however, kind of a longer-term piece that I want you to think about, which is that while today the number of people I think will actually download and use this data directly is relatively small, but they will have a much, much larger audience, we're entering a world where data and information and computers are becoming central to our lives.
Pierre?
And more people are going to become literate in using and understanding data and in writing software. And the example I always use is, we didn't build libraries after everybody learned how to read. Like, we didn't wait till the whole world could read and then we built a library and said, come and read. No, we built libraries before, like 90% of the people in the world knew how to read. We built them because we knew that we had to provide material so people could learn how to read. Like, nothing would make me more excited than for there to be a Canadian data portal so that high school students, university students, graduate students, and ordinary citizens would have data sets about their country, about who they are, about their own narratives that they can use to learn how to become more computer literate and how to become more data literate. This is, I think, the library of the 21st century that we need to be building.
Thank you very much, Mr. Poilievre. We're now going to start the second round, 5 minutes each. Mr. McCallum.
Thank you. Very interesting. As an economist, I find this very interesting. As a politician, there's a certain political element that I'd like to ask you about that I don't think we've really discussed very much, because in an important sense, information is power. And there are lots of kinds of information that governments in general, and this government in particular, doesn't want others to get hold of. And just to give you two examples, the Parliamentary Budget Officer has had a running battle with the Department of Finance for several years, and the government tries to deprive him of information. Under your system, he could get it instantly with a click of a switch, and the government might not like that. Or a second example, the opposition accused the government and its infrastructure program of favoring conservative-held or minister-held ridings. The government denied it. If all the information was freely available instantly, we'd click on the switch and could prove it, if it was true. So, I mean, we tend to think this government's particularly secretive, but every government will have some information they'd rather keep to themselves and not share. So I guess my question to you is, how did you overcome this issue, or how did Australia and the UK, which seem to both have made major strides in providing much more open information, how did they overcome this kind of political impediment?
So I can't speak to Australia because I haven't seen as much of what they've done with the open data, but I was there, I was in London at the announcement when the British government announced that they were going to release all spending data. This is not budget, this is actual spend data down to the 25,000K level.
By riding, by constituency?
No, by ministry.
Oh.
So any bill any ministry ever paid over 25,000K was going to be made available to the public.
But not geographically, by
not
subset
geographically.
Of the UK.
But you can take that data and look at where that money is being spent, because you see the bill, so you can see where the PO is and things like that. So you can begin to digest geographically where it ends up. And I remember as a conservative minister, and he stood up and he said, I know that people are going to find things out that we're not happy about, and I also know that it's going to make us better. And that was about it. So I'm not trying to pretend like there was enormous political will. I think the British have the advantage of being in a budget situation where they know they need all the help they can get, and so they're willing to try to do something that I think is very, very innovative in order to try to save themselves, hundreds of millions of pounds. One of the things that I think, I agree that every government's going to have some incentives to not share information. My hope is that when governments choose not to share this information forget about the parliamentary budget officer, but with ordinary Canadians, they are in fact disrespecting our right to access what our government does. And I'm not trying to say that past governments or this government are doing that on purpose. I think what has happened is that things have changed. The technology now exists for us to do radically more, and that our governments need to adapt, and they need to figure out that the end user of this data is no longer a journalist, it's no longer a researcher, it's the ordinary citizen.
So are you saying that we have to call on this government's better nature or sense of altruism?
I do think we need to, call on its better nature, but I think we also need to call on its desire for fiscal responsibility and its desire for economic development and its desire for democratic engagement.
On the economic side, Government, I mentioned the number $6 to $8 billion, I think, pounds benefit in the UK. Is that correct? And what is the nature of that number? And presumably, if it's that many pounds for the UK, it might be that many dollars for Canada?
Yeah, I think that number is generated. I won't say I'm intimately familiar with the methodology that produced that survey, but I believe that was a combination of improved efficiencies within government and new businesses and efficiencies that would be created in the private sector because of better access to data.
And creating new companies.
Sorry.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Creating new companies in the digital economy?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Mr. McCallum. Ms. Davidson, 5 minutes, please.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Chair, and thanks, Mr. Eves, for being with us today. Certainly, it's been an interesting presentation that you've given us, and certainly when you started out saying that anyone under 30 would probably think that our system is broken, and you look around this room, maybe we need to have some younger people sitting at this table too for this particular exercise. And I certainly am not an expert in technicalities when it comes to the internet and to these types of things, but it's certainly been an interesting learning experience. The one thing that I just want to, it's sort of along the lines that the last questioner was asking, was along the economic end of it. You talked a little bit about, you said it strengthens the economy through better data access, and there's, and then you used an example, I think, of billions of gallons of oil that can be saved because people are using GPS and are not getting lost anymore. And how do jurisdictions quantify or identify something like that?
That's a great question. And I don't have a good answer for you in the short term. How are you going to? Can you directly attribute a savings to the release of a given data set? I think that's going to be a very, very tough challenge. What I think you are going to be able to see is over time, I think, again, we're very, very early days, but over time, I think you're going to see there are certain economies that have access to more information about their economy and about the communities they serve, and because they have more access to that information, they are going to become more efficient and they're going to grow faster. Data really is, it's like the plankton of our ecosystem in the 21st, like of the economy in the 21st century. And so if you starve that system of plankton or another system has more of it, they're going to thrive more. And so I think that there's going to be some very simple examples that we're going to be able to look at. And there might be some specific ones. When I look at Vancouver, I look at some of the stuff that's been done. There's a local architecture firm, Bing Tom Architects, that has taken open data from the city's portal and has written a number of reports that's looked at what rising sea levels will do to the city of Vancouver and the cost it will have on building infrastructure. Those reports are very powerful for city hall staff and for councillors. I don't know how much kind of free consulting services we've gotten from Bing Tom Architects so far, but I got to believe it's somewhere north of $100,000 to $200,000. So that's real value that's generated for the city and for the citizens. Can I quantify that en masse? I think that's going to be a very difficult challenge.
Okay. Well, I think that, it is definitely extremely important that this information becomes available. And certainly, I think the people on this side of the table are certainly supportive of open data and open government. And one of the things we started out, we talked about proactive disclosure when we first started talking about this exercise, and then it changed into open government, and I think you have indicated that there's certainly a lot of differences. Could you elaborate on that a little bit more?
Yeah, so I think open data is, we take the information that government's collecting, again, that doesn't have privacy or security implications, and we simply share it with the public, I would argue, as we receive it. Proactive disclosure, for me, applies less to data and applies more to information. So it's saying, okay, well, we've written some reports, we've made an analysis, we have a proposed policy, and we are going to release that before the allotted time where we're allowed to keep it secret, runs by, or in anticipation of a public debate that we think needs to happen. So for me, kind of proactive disclosure is, disclosing things in advance of when you need to be, or just aggressively disclosing information. I would love to see more proactive disclosure as well. I just want to keep it separate from the open data debate, which I think doesn't have the same constraints to it that open information does.
When you talk about the open data distribution, is there any issue with the integrity of that information that gets posted? Like, are people able to do whatever with that information? And is that a concern in any of the jurisdictions that have done it, that some of the integrity has not been maintained?
So the answer is yes. Anybody can. So I want to be very clear. No one can change, on the open data portal, say like at the City of Vancouver, no one can go and change the data that the City of Vancouver has.
Do with it then is where it can be changed.
They could take the data and then they could change the data that they have on themselves, and then they could share that. But the fidelity of that data is maintained because anybody who looks at something that's created with it will simply go back to the original and compare them and say, well, why did you change these things? The other thing that I've noticed is that frequently I get this question from government officials who are worried that people are going to change the data. I'll be honest with you, when I talk to developers and researchers out there, they're not concerned about changing the data. They're actually really concerned about your data being accurate. Because, like, when a Google map is incorrect because the information that the government gave Google is incorrect, or like when you have spending projections and like someone made a typo in a spending projection document, people don't get mad at the government. They get mad at the company that created the application or offers the service. And so they're like, well, I want to make sure it's accurate as possible. So I think people are much more worried about government's data being accurate than they are worried about, than I think we should be about people changing the data and doing something with it. Because when they do, we'll still be able to check on them.
Pat?
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Davidson. Madame Tilak. Thank you.
Bonjour.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to begin wishing everyone in here a Happy New Year. And to you, Mr. Eves, thank you for being here. And thank you for enlightening us on your vision. This is all very interesting. I have a couple of questions for you following the open letter which you sent on April 8th last. You stated at point 2, I don't know if you know what I'm referring to.
Like I'll remember it fairly quickly.
OK, parfait. Au point 2,
So at point 2, you say transform the committee into a government 2.0 task force similar to the Australian effort. But then you go on to say, frankly, my favorite approach in this space has been the British. Which one do you prefer?
Take an aggressive position towards open data and to stand up and say, regardless of what this committee is doing, we are tomorrow going to create an open data portal. We are going to put these data sets up on it. And then when the committee makes its report, we will then look at that and adjust our strategy accordingly and take the best of their ideas and incorporate them. And I see there's nothing that prevents us from doing that.
OK.
My big fear is that we're going to sit around and wait till we have the perfect answer, and that we're never going to have a perfect answer. We're going to have good answers, and we already have them. So let's move forward with those today and make them better as we discover more things tomorrow.
Okay. Mais ma question aussi.
I'll repeat a second question, which comes to mind based on your answer. What do you mean when you say that, or rather, what examples are better than what's happened in Australia?
Again, where rather than wait for a task force, a committee to make recommendations, they have chosen to move forward and implement kind of a very aggressive open data strategy without the input from a task force. But then, as people have made recommendations, they've course corrected and adjusted and made it better. So my preference is that model, that the government move forward. But short of that, I would love to see this committee look at the task force and see what lessons it can draw from the Australian task force to make itself better and stronger.
Okay. Là, dans la deuxième page.
On page 2, in the second paragraph, you say that the committee should copy the best elements of the Australian task force, and that it should be non-partisan. In fact, it should be pan-partisan, which the committee already is. Can you please explain what exactly you mean by that? And perhaps explain to the committee what you mean by that.
The model itself after the task force to think about, could it include non-parliamentarians on it, and to find a group of Canadians who are pan-partisan, so who are genuinely interested in figuring out how to best share the data that government has and how to make government as open as possible given the constraints, and to invite them to sit on the process and to participate. I think there's an enormous amount of expertise in this country, and it would be sad to me if they weren't leveraged simply because they weren't able to sit on this committee as elected officials, but they were at your disposal to be used whenever necessary.
OK. Puis là, je vais être certaine.
I just want to be sure I understand, because pan-partisan can mean several things. What exactly does that mean to you? What is your definition of the word pan-partisan?
Made open declarations of their party affiliations, but I think more interesting to me is there are a lot of Canadians out there who really don't identify with any political party, but are deeply interested in their government being as open as possible and being a platform for innovation and improved services. And I'd be looking to figure out who those Canadians are, and I'm actually pretty sure that if this committee put its head to it, it could identify 3 or 4 people who are like that. Okay. Sorry, and just as a side ironic note, nobody asked, but the French version of that document that you're reading actually went through Google Translate and never was edited after that fact. So even this committee already is using Google Translate to read its documents. So.
I should correct the last answer. I think my understanding here that the document was translated by the Library of Parliament. Not saying. Mr.
Maybe it was. We can investigate more closely.
Mr. 685 minutes.
Not going on the other side, Chair. Okay. Thank you, Chair. Mr. Hughes, I wanted to come back. You had mentioned that the British had proposed to centralize data in a central organization, a public data corporation, you called it. Can you say a little bit more about that, and maybe say how that's different from our Statistics Canada?
Yeah, so Statistics Canada only has data that it collects, that it hosts. Mm-hmm. I think what the British are intending on doing is significantly more radical than that, which is to say they want to look at data that any ministry collects and to centralize it and manage it from one agency. That's a much grander vision than what that StatsCan does, and it's actually a grander vision than what I'm aware of any government doing at the moment. But I do think it has real benefits. One of the big benefits is that it's going to standardize the way we collect and manage information and data. And the second is it's going to make it much easier to share that data with the public. Again, that's what Washington, D.C., the city of Washington, D.C. did, is their IT department began to slowly, kind of through bilateral negotiations, host the data that different departments were collecting, and over time they actually host a huge amount of the data now, and that's one of the reasons they were able to share it so quickly, was because it was located in one place. They could just flick a switch and start sharing it with the public.
So do the British plan on enrolling their equivalent of Stats Canada into this, or is it?
That I cannot comment. I don't know, and my understanding is that corporation is still just a proposal. It's not actually policy.
Okay. Now, I know you've also written on your blog and maybe in other places about your concern around the long-form census and how. So, can you say something about how you see that affecting the overall open data project?
So I'm not sure that the long-form. I mean, I've been quite vocal about the long-form census. I'm not really sure it falls under the purview of this committee's kind of around the debate around open data. What I would say is that the information collected by StatsCan is enormously valuable to not just the government, but to a huge number of nonprofits and to companies, and that we need to be thinking about that data as an asset for making our economy stronger, our social sector stronger, and our government more effective and more efficient, and that when we choose to limit the amount of information that we collect, we limit all of those sectors and how effective they can be. So I think that is something that needs to have some real debate. Mostly, though, whether the long-form census data is included or not, I think more importantly, we need to think about how are we going to get StatsCan data shared with the public in open formats and free, because they've already paid for it.
But you would agree that if there's any restriction on the kind of data that's collected by StatsCan or any lessening of that, that is an issue around what government data is available to be shared with people and used by
if you apply any license that restricts the use of data, then you have to expect that people are not going to use that data in the most creative and the most innovative way. So there's a penalty that you pay whenever you do that. And I just don't understand why you would ever limit the use of a public asset like that, especially one that is completely reusable.
Now, you talk about this being one of the key aspects of this needs to be that the data is provided free to Canadians, to businesses to use, that there be no charge for that. Does that amount to a subsidy to businesses for using a resource that Canadians have paid for, that Canadians have put together?
So I'd actually argue right now it's the inverse, which is that ordinary Canadians are subsidizing corporations. That the only reason StatsCan is able to collect this data is because it has access to the consumer, the citizens' tax base, and it can use that to finance the collection of the census and larger data sets. And then it turns around and it sells those to those who can afford it. So right now you have your and my tax dollars paying to collect data that then gets sold, and that you and I may not actually be able to afford to be able to buy. So this does two things. One is it means any citizen who has an interesting new business idea now has a barrier to entry that their larger competitors can afford, and so they simply pay and keep them out. But more importantly, sorry, so someone just say it's not that expensive. So I think if you're a startup, every cost is an expensive cost, and if you're a nonprofit, any expense, any dollar that you're spending on StatsCan data is a dollar that you're not spending on housing someone or figuring out how to deliver a service more efficiently. If you're a city, every dollar you're spending on StatsCan data is money that you're not spending on helping citizens' lives get better. So we can debate whether the cost is relevant or not, but the really disturbing thing about the cost is that almost every academic research done out there shows that the amount of money that you raise by charging for data, the only thing it pays for is the system for charging for data. That there's almost no money to be made in charging for data. So what we really have is a system that simply feeds itself. We're charging for data to pay for people who can charge people for paying for data. We're not actually making a huge amount of money off of this. And so what we really have is we have citizens who are subsidizing kind of wealthier actors in our economy.
Hey, Bill?
Guess I'm done.
Ms. Davidson, do you want to?
Yes, just briefly.
Go ahead. 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you. I just had one further question. When you were talking about the machine-readable format, and you were saying that the PDF form that a lot of our government data is available in could be a concern when it comes to machine-readable. And so are we looking at huge costs or considerable costs or expenses to redevelop the way that we now provide this information, or that we now have this information, the form that it's in, I guess. And then you talked in your letter that you sent us that starting in January, parliamentary website will begin releasing Hansard in the XML. Was that a major change, or is that something that's fairly easily done?
So I have kind of two responses to that. The first is actually I was told that Parliament would start releasing the Hansard in XML, but actually haven't been to the website in the last couple of days. But as far as I can tell, it still hasn't, which is a little bit of a disappointment to those of us who were looking forward to that.
Wouldn't today be the first day, though, that...
Maybe. That's why I want to say I haven't actually been to the website. So if it's happened, I don't want to I don't want to upset our good friends who I know who are working to try to make this happen. Will there be a cost? I don't want to sit here and say there wouldn't be a cost, because that would be untrue. But here's the two other ways I think you need to be thinking about this, and one of this is going to become a little bit larger, and so I'll stop if this gets too boring for people. But the first is, at some point, you're going to have to upgrade the systems that are collecting this data anyways. And if you're not collecting this data in a format that can be shared, then you're restricting use just within the government. Right? One of the things I like about open data portals is that once you make the data available to me, you've made the data functionally available to anybody, no matter where they are, whether they're in government, whether in the nonprofit, whether in the for-profit sector. And so that in itself should drive some efficiencies. It should help cover any cost that there is in that transition. But eventually you're going to have to make that expense anyways. Like at some point you're going to replace the system, and you're going to have to spend that money. So maybe we don't get all the data tomorrow, but we have a plan in place so that as we transition systems, we also make sure they can always export the data in a machine-readable format that the public can use. But the second part of this, and the one that I think is more interesting from a government expenditure perspective, is that once you have data in open formats, you really change the dynamic of the relationship that you have with a lot of IT vendors. Many IT vendors purposely create data in formats that are very, very, very closed. In fact, so closed that they're the only company that knows how to use that data and can write software for that data. And as a result, the government of Canada is now stuck using that vendor until that vendor goes out of business or until it decides it's going to make a very painful transition out of that kind of data format and data structure. One of the really powerful opportunities around open data is that it will open up the marketplace for competition in the IT sector in government. That other players now will be able to look and go, wow, if that's the data that you're collecting, we could actually collect that data for you using this system that would be much cheaper, and we can share it with the public in these ways that's much more interesting. And so I think we can begin to change our relationship with the vendors and try to shrink some of the enormous contracts that we give out in the IT space.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Davidson. We're going to conclude with Mr. McCallum.
Thank you. On Australia and UK, you did make a recommendation on process in the sense of expanding this committee to include some experts. But I'm interested in the substance of either what they've done in Australia or UK. You know the Canadian system of the degree to which information is available or not available to the public. So in what ways have either Australia or UK changed their system to be more information friendly than Canada is today?
Yeah, so both governments have launched open data portals. So there's data.gov.uk, which has tens of thousands of data sets on it. Again, as I talked, everything from real spending data to information about all of the local, because they have a connection with the local councils, all the budgets for local councils, I believe, are supposed to be going up there soon as well.
So that's right now. We can.
That's right now. That site's, I believe, almost 2 years old now. And the Australian site is a little bit newer and doesn't have quite as much data, but it has been launched. And they've also tackled the licensing regime around data. So here you have parliamentary democracies like ours that have crown copyright, and they've worked very hard to rethink what the licenses are for the information and for the data they release. So for example, the Australians, when they released their most recent budget, I believe, they released it under a Creative Commons license, not a copyright license, so that people could use the information in the budget more openly and do whatever they wanted with it. So I thought was really interesting and innovative. And the British, I think, are working on a whole new licensing regime for everything they publish, which is very, very, very liberal, allows for basically any type of reuse.
Well, I remember the U.S., too. When we were comparing Canadian and U.S. fiscal stimulus plans, one could go onto a U.S. website and get very detailed information that certainly did not exist in Canada. So would you say U.S., U.K., and Australia, U.K., and U.S. are way ahead of us right now?
Yeah, we are.
Including the U.S.
Yeah, we are falling further and further behind, and I would say significantly behind, because the moment you decide to do this, there's a runway that you have to go down in order to even just get to the place where you can launch. So, you know, it's not so the British, I mean, I think their site's now 2 years old. The Americans definitely 2 years old. It's not like we are 2 years behind them. We need to be thinking more along the lines of we are 4 years behind them.
Okay. So what about the open information? So you've talked about portals containing data for those 3 countries. What about comparing their access to information with ours?
You know, I won't claim to know the American, the British access information systems as well as I could to be able to really make a strong comparison. All I know is that
Australia,
nor the Australian. Oh. But all I will say is that the amount of time that one has to wait for an access information request to be completed in Canada is so long that I would argue the system is broken, and we need to radically rethink how we're doing this. And this is one of the reasons why I think open data is interesting, is that when you look at the U.S., there's been some evidence that open data portals have actually reduced the amount of what we would call ATIP requests, therefore taking some of the pressure off that system.
Okay, thank you. Carolyn?
David, I understand that in the mid-'80s they brought in cost recovery at Stats Canada. But I understand that they don't really make a lot of money from it. 6 million, something like that. It's
very hard to pin down. It's very hard to pin down how much money Stats Canada actually makes from the data it sells on its website.
So but selling a intricate analysis for a company, we think that they should pay for that. But
Absolutely.
The real data is, if it was up and free, you're saying that would really contribute to our economy.
Right. I mean, so my understanding is that that Stats Canada makes the bulk of its money off kind of very customized surveys for specific players, or in writing kind of reports for the government. The raw data itself does not generate significant amount of revenue for them, and so really it's just an impediment to people in other sectors making use of it in interesting ways.
At the Public Health Agency, obviously the FCM and the municipalities were pretty upset at having to pay for data, you know, as municipal governments, but we were able to provide the map generator project where they could actually at least put that data in and get maps out of it in terms of GIS mapping of social determinants of health, all those sorts of things. So that's just sort of an example of all of the things that you could do as government to make it easy for people to see the data, or the, whatever we used to say, if a picture's worth 1,000 words, a map is worth 1,000 pictures.
Right.
There's a whole bunch of ways that government could actually be helping citizens understand how their money's being spent and the results they're getting from it.
And the kind of innovative services that we could be rolling out. I mean, like one of the things that struck me, and maybe they're doing this, but from what I could tell from their website, they're not, but I believe it's Agriculture Canada has a widget which shows you kind of products that have been recalled. And that, you know, you can put this in your blog, or, you know, you can go to their website and look at it. Well, I got to be honest with you. I'm like, I can't really think of anybody who's going to Agriculture Canada's website to check to see what products have been recalled. Like, people just don't do that. And nobody's even like going to be putting a widget in their blog so that you can keep up to date. Much more interesting to me is if that data was available through, I don't want to get too technical, but through something we call an API, so that people can go and like ping that database and find out what actually has been recalled. Because if you did that, then supermarkets could build it into their system. So if somebody accidentally stocks something, the moment it gets barcoded, it would ring, and because actually this product's been recalled. People now with their iPhones, you can actually use the camera to scan a barcode to find out how much something costs and where it's cheaper. You could get a message right then saying, actually, this product's been recalled. So you could build it into all these systems, and we can begin to talk about what the reduction in healthcare costs that might reveal, the efficiencies in distribution, so goods actually just get dumped the moment they don't get shipped all over the place, and then we discover that they're actually going to get recalled. So here's a system where the federal government has data that is enormously interesting to the public, enormously interesting to industry, and yet shares it in this very closed way where you can only use it on their terms. If they just had an API into it, then all of a sudden we could do much, much more interesting things.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bennett. That concludes the final round of questioning, Mr. Eaves. On behalf of the committee, I want to thank you for your appearance here today. The testimony was very interesting, very informative. You've given us a lot of food for thought, but before we leave, we have another committee item we have to deal with. Do you have any closing comments or remarks you want to leave the committee with?
No, mostly I would say is, while I understand that this topic appears rather technical, there is a growing group, a kind of movement of people out there who are deeply interested in the information data that government has, and the kind of the businesses that can be built about it, the way that democratic engagement can be done with it. It's, I think, a loud and growing group. And so I urge this committee to think very carefully about its recommendations and try to be as aggressive as possible, because they will not stop in their demands. And most importantly, I want to make the committee know that I am available anytime they want. If they have further questions or any advice or help that they may want, make myself available at a moment's notice.
Well, again, thank you very much for your wisdom. Okay. Okay, we're going to move right ahead to the dealing with the report of the steering committee, which was held earlier today. That document has been circulated. The steering committee did have a fairly extensive agenda there today, and I'll just go over. I want to highlight the main items for the benefit of the committee, and there's been 5 of them. First of all, the witness schedule for open government or open data study be approved as presented, and that witness list has been circulated to all members of the committee. That the second item I'm going to elaborate a little bit on, colleagues, that was this committee previously consented to an e-consultation taking place regarding the open government study, and the Library of Parliament was instructed to go to the market and invite bids for this. They did, and there was no bids received. And what we are recommending to the committee, that there was about 20 people downloaded our RFP, but there were really only 3 legitimate people, or companies I should say, that would be in this type of business. And what the steering committee is recommending that we go back to those 3 bidders and meet with all of them and come back to this committee with one recommendation. The third item is that the clerk draft a letter on behalf of the committee to both the government, encouraging them to move forward with the Open Government Initiative, and further that the committee write a second letter to the Speaker of the House, recommending that the Board of Internal Economy study the possibility of an Open Parliament Initiative, and that is in line with some of the issues that Mr. Eves raised this afternoon, that we as ourselves should be moving on some of these issues perhaps faster than we are right now. The fourth issue, the steering committee felt it wise that the clerk draft a letter for further review by the steering committee to the Speaker of the House, recommending that the Board of Internal Economy study the possibility of additional resources or additional capacity for future e-consultation processes, because we're all a little, we think that this is going to be something that various House committees will be doing more of in the future, than the capacity should be there within Parliament. And then lastly, that we did receive an order of reference regarding the 5-year review of the Lobbying Act, and that we would tentatively start that on March 23rd, 2011. So that is a summary of the minutes of the steering committee. The chair would entertain a motion for their so moved. Mr. Clan, you have a point you want to raise?
Yeah, Mr. Chair. I noticed that that the motion with respect to CBC is not scheduled until the 21st of March.
23rd, I think. Is it 23rd?
And
21st, okay. Yeah.
21st or 23rd, or 21st, I think it was. And I can only imagine how excited CBC is to come before the committee and start moving on this. So I'm wondering if there's an opportunity for us to push that forward. And perhaps even schedule it sometime within the next couple of weeks. March 21st is a heck of a long time, and it's certainly something that's quite important to me. I've received a lot of feedback on, and I'd very much like to start that as soon as possible.
Yeah, no, we do. Well, if I could speak to that, and I'll ask the clerk if he could anything to add. We did try and get it on earlier, and we did. There was a lot of negotiation on this issue, and you're probably right. They weren't as excited as perhaps your suggestion. But anyway, they are coming, and it is March 21st, but we tried different dates prior to that. Not only was CBC, but also the Information Commissioner wasn't available in a lot of those dates too. So the earliest date that we could accommodate both of them was the 21st of March.
Can you just elaborate for me on negotiation? Who are we negotiating with? I think we passed a motion, and I'm not sure who we'd be negotiating with.
Well, what the policy of the committee, I'll just take you through what we generally do. Yeah. First of all, we're generally reflective of the, people have certain schedules and they are busy, but we do make it imperative that they understand that we want them to come. And we get that pushback from all the departments too. We want a certain person, and they'll say, we'll send a junior person. And there's always that pushback from departments and agencies, and in this case we wanted both individuals there. We felt it was important that both the Information Commissioner and the Senior Executive of CBC be present for this hearing, and we pushed for that, and that was our premise, and this was the real date that, and it's not only the CBC, but it would be the Information Commissioner too wasn't available in a lot of dates. Do you have anything to add to that, Chad?
No, Mr. Chair. I think that's.
Just to inquire. So if we're talking March 21st, I just wanted on the record, I'd like this to be brought sooner than March 21st, and this is of such importance. I would hope that the President of the CBC would find a little time in his schedule to accommodate parliamentarians who are providing $1.5 billion or over $1 billion to them. So I would ask the clerk that you actually inquire again about his ability to come and meet with parliamentarians. I know they report on issues of accountability quite aggressively and with some thirst. So I can only imagine that when you're talking about their accountability and their ability to report to the Canadian people how their money is being spent, that they would be very excited to come here and explain to Canadians how that is spent. So I'm wondering if you could direct the clerk for me, Mr. Chair. I know you've done a lot of work on this, but if you could direct the clerk to inquire again about the availability of CBC personnel to come. Also, I certainly going to think that I would, in some of the thoughts that I had, one meeting I don't think will satisfy where I want to, what I want to get out of this. So we're going to need a bit more time with that. But I'm wondering if you could, if there was, when you did approach CBC, did they give you any additional dates that he was available, or was it just that one date that he was available? And can we start with other individuals within the CBC? And what other options do we have? I just think March 21st is a long time away. We passed this motion before Christmas, and you're talking 3 months before we move down the road of even opening this up. And by this schedule, you've only given it one day. So. How many days did he give you when you approached the President? How many days did he give you, opportunities? Or was that the only day? Was he eager and excited to come on that one day? Or was, when you say negotiation, was this?
Well, from my perspective, Mr. Chair, we offered February 16th as the initial day. Unfortunately, the president of the CBC at that point was previously engaged at another event that he'd committed to long ago. And so in talking with the chair after, we proposed another day, at which point they informed us that unfortunately the legal counsel wasn't available at the time. So again, through the chair communicating with CBC, we were able to come to the 21st as a date that suited them, and the Information Commissioner's office it suited them as well, and that's the way I proceeded. As soon as I could find a date that suited both of them, without any other direction from the committee, that's the way the chair and I proceeded to schedule the witnesses.
Okay. I appreciate that, and I know you've worked hard on it, but I would implore the chair then that if he could, and the clerk could try again to impress upon on the CBC that it's a date that's convenient for parliamentarians and for the people of Canada, not the chairman or the president's schedule or the legal counsel's schedule. It's $1 billion that we're talking about here, and there's a lot of questions that have been raised, and I would think that they would be a little bit more accommodating when Parliament has asked them to come here before them, and especially in light of the fact that they've certainly, shown that enthusiasm when it comes to how parliamentarians do their jobs. I would think that they would take that same enthusiasm to appear here as soon as possible. And March 21st for me is completely unacceptable. I would hope that we would find some space, especially when you're talking about $1 billion, and especially when you're talking the type of feedback that I've received since then. I think they have to appear here before then. So I would implore you, Mr. Chair, to try again to impress upon them how important it is that they actually come here and do that, and also perhaps entertain some additional witnesses that I would like to bring forward and some other people. So if we could consider even more days than the one that we've brought.
We can explore that, Mr. Calandra. It probably won't change, but we'll certainly go back to because not only there's 2 or 3 issues. Not only is there the President and Chief Executive Officer, CBC, but there is the Information Commissioner herself, and the committee felt it's important to have both of them there. And secondly, the second issue, of course, is we are booked ourselves with confirmed witnesses for the next couple of weeks at least, and but we can certainly go back and we'll explore that and see if there's any possible earlier date, and we'll get back to you on that point. But I should say that this issue not only arises with CBC, but arises with most other departments too. Like we have to accommodate, and we do it within reason, and there's always invariably pushback to come to any parliamentary committee. It's like, I know when I was the Public Accounts Committee, we always insisted on the Deputy Minister. Well, the Deputy Minister invariably didn't want to come, so we had to push that. And a lot of times we used the S word, the summons, and that got their attention finally, and then they get used to that, and then they eventually came. And so you have to be, there is a balance there that we try and reach, but it is, and some of these officers of Parliament are busy too, but that leads to another issue that I have some concerns with. They are officers of Parliament, they're accountable to Parliament, they're responsible to Parliament, and they should be able to appear before Parliament in a reasonably, we can't demand that they come next Wednesday or come next Thursday, but if we give them 2 dates within a 3-week out period, I think they should be prepared to come too. But we'll go back to that, we'll explore that. Mr. Albrecht, you have a comment on this?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I certainly concur with my colleagues' sentiments regarding CBC, both on the timing of requesting that they appear earlier, but also on the issue of the number of sessions we may need. I'd like to just speak to number 2 and number 4 of the report as it relates to the e-consultation on the process. I have 2 concerns that actually were heightened by the witness remarks today in terms of the length of time and this potential slowing down of the process. And I see number 2 as a definite adding additional time to the process. And it's made worse by the fact that we're potentially investing a lot of dollars in a consultation process that, quite frankly, with the technology we have available to us today, I think should be able to be done for far less, whether it's a website that we create or a Facebook account. We've talked about other alternatives earlier, and I just don't want us to see as a committee to authorize hundreds of thousands of dollars for an e-consultation process that will, first of all, slow down the process, cost a lot of money, and I'm not convinced that we need to do a lot of additional research. We have many governments who have already implemented this system. I know that we need some Canadian-specific input, and we want to welcome that. We don't want to shut the door on that. But I don't think we need to reinvent the wheel and going through this whole process again, adding time, adding an inordinate amount of cost. So I'm concerned on those 2 points, Mr. Chair.
Well, I think Ms. Bennett wants to speak on that, but I think your point, and it's a good point, Mr. Albrecht, but one of the points that you did make is that, and this is covered in item 4, is that the House itself should have more capacity to do this type of initiative rather than going to the external marketplace. And this is what the point that we're raising in item 4. Ms. Bennett, you've got a comment on that?
It's just that for a study on open government, I think it's very important that we have the capacity to go to Canadians who want the data, and particularly the people in the David Eves cohort that actually are eagerly anticipating. In order for us to get it right, we need to hear from them, such that we would write the best possible report reflecting the needs of Canadians. And a website just doesn't do that. This is a very there is a methodology that works, and I think it's imperative that Canada set and that our Parliament sets a standard for how we could do a modern version of consulting Canadians rather than just the traditional way of bringing witnesses before this committee. We did one in 2002. It was extremely effective, 90% success rate in terms of people saying they would do it again because they knew they'd been heard. And I think we've almost lost a decade in being able to get Parliament relevant to Canadians. So I don't think we can settle for less. I think we actually have to do a proper piece of work in this consulting with Canadians, and that it will be a pilot and experiment, and as the fourth item shows, that we hope eventually we can be able to bring that capacity within the House of Commons and within the Library of Parliament in terms of the content for the sites. But I would ask any of you to go and have a look at the study we did on the future of CPP disability at the Disability Subcommittee of the HRSD Committee, as well as Michael Kirby's excellent report on mental health. And that's how Kirby's report ended up as good as it was. That's how our report ended up as good as it was, because we found interesting, exciting people with real value added out who we never would have met if it hadn't been for this e-consultation.
And I should point out too that this is just the next step in the process. Whatever comes from the meetings will come back to the committee. This is not an authorization to spend money. It comes back to the committee. Okay, all in favor of the minutes as circulated? Contrary-minded? Motion carried. Okay, if there's nothing further to come before seeing nothing further to come before the meeting, I will adjourn the meeting.